Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the European position on the Iranian nuclear program, Britain's withdrawal from the EU or Brexit, and European relations with both Turkey and Russia. To talk about all of this, we are joined by David Tafuri, international lawyer and former U.S. State Department official, and Federiga Bindi, non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much both for joining me today, David and Federiga. I do want to start by talking about this. The topic of this episode is going to be about the EU and the differences that we're seeing in dynamic between the United States approach to foreign policy and the European Union, obviously, and the issues within the EU itself, including Brexit. I want to ask you, and I want to see who wants to start. Probably Federiga would like to start because you are joining us from California. How do you see the European approach working in terms of the Iranian threat? And then obviously the Hermes, now the new threats on oil companies and the industry in itself.
So the Europeans have vehemently opposed President Trump's decision to leave the Iran deal, and they said they would go forward regardless. High Representative Federica Mogherini also said that the Europeans would create a vehicle, that is to say, a way for European companies to keep trade with Iran, but without incurring in the American sanctions. But the reality is that the vehicle doesn't work. Exactly 1 year ago, I was in Brussels, and people who know the issue very well were clearly telling me that the Iran deal without the US does not work. So the Europeans are talking a lot about it, especially Federica Mogherini, but the reality is that she can't move much.
What do you think, David? I mean, but it seems that Iran continues to threat and continues to talk about the deal as of, we're still in it, but if you don't do such and such, we will be enriching the uranium. We will be doing so and so. There's still the talk as if the deal still stands today.
Right. So the latest news from yesterday is that Iran is now threatening to go back to enriching uranium starting on June 27th. So that's really soon, in essentially 10 days. And that will be a clear violation of the Iran nuclear deal. Once they do that, they put the Europeans in a very difficult place because the Europeans are trying to stay with the deal, trying to keep the deal valid, but Iran is going to go out of compliance with the deal. So it puts the Europeans in a very difficult space. They have to either decide to also side with America now and pull out of the deal also because Iran is violating it, or stay in a deal that actually is no longer working and is no longer serving its purpose. The real purpose and objective of the deal is to make sure that Iran gives up its nuclear ambitions and doesn't move its nuclear weapons program further, which it will be able to do once it is stockpiling enriched uranium again.
What do you say about that, Federica? Because also, you said that it's not working. Do you mean that when Iran pulls out of it, this would be the basically intended policy by this administration, or is it going to be even worse now if Iran pulls out of the deal? Some people said it does work. It did work, and Iran did not violate the deal. What do you answer to that?
It actually absolutely worked. There were inspection of the IAEA as foreseen by the treaty. Iran has been absolutely compliant. The problem is that this administration, or at least some people in this administration, have decided that they want to do war with Iran, which is very, very wrong move. And they're trying every excuse to put Iran into a corner. And the Europeans simply have enough leverage to stop. They also are unable to cope with someone who is so unpredictable by Trump is. They are, on the one side, think that sooner or later, somewhere in the future, we will go back to business as usual with the American administration. They quite have not understood what Trump is. So they are between a rock and a hard place as well. And this is very quickly going towards a major crisis, which we will deeply regret.
I mean, David, I do want to redirect this to you. I mean, I know we're going to be moving more to the EU in a minute, but about the nuclear deal, some experts also said that regardless of Iran complying or not complying, there's Iran's activities in the region, supporting terrorist activities, sectarian militias or terrorist militias, and obviously ballistic missile program, and not allowing inspectors to go to specific sites underground in Iran, that there might be some activities there. So do you agree with Federiga that, you know, it's the administration that decided to go to war with Iran, and the deal was working just fine?
Well, I think by all accounts and trusted reports, the deal was being complied with by Iran. And again, the deal was limited to getting Iran to give up its nuclear weapons program. It didn't address some of the other things that you mentioned, like Iran's support for terrorism and its support for Shia proxy forces in countries and its efforts to destabilize its neighbors and other countries in the region, like Iraq and like Syria. The deal was never meant to address those things, and Iran clearly was engaging in those things. The better stance of the U.S. once we had already entered into the deal was probably to stay in the deal and to find other ways to try and pressure Iran to stop doing those things, supporting terrorism, supporting proxy forces, destabilizing its neighbors. But the Trump administration, as Federiga mentioned, chose another route, which is just to pull out of the deal completely. When I do agree with her that once the U.S. pulled out of the deal, it was going to be very hard for that deal ever to stay in place, because Europe alone really couldn't maintain that deal, especially when the U.S. started to put maximum pressure on Iran by putting in place even harsher sanctions and putting in place secondary sanctions that sanction any company, even if it's based in a European country where European laws allowed it to do business in Iran, but it would potentially suffer sanctions non-compliance under the U.S. sanctions.
I mean, Federiga, I do want to ask you, unless you want to say something as a response to David, you know, it is also that the Iranian regime right now is using some form of terrorism to retaliate and attack, according to American intelligence reports and the Pentagon, that Iran has been attacking now oil shipments coming out of the Hormuz. What do you think of this Iranian response to the American decision to pull out of the deal and increase sanctions?
First of all, I would like to respectfully remind that according to American intelligence, we had the absolute certitude that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the whole Western world went into war against Iraq, and clearly there were no weapons of mass destruction. The ships which were attacked were Japanese, and the Japanese Prime Minister has said that there is no evidence, no definitive evidence that this is an Iranian attack. So I would, first of all, be very careful before saying that this is an Iranian attack and saying because the CIA, because the American intelligence says so, this is so. We have proof that in the past American intelligence has badly misjudged. So this is number one. Secondly, I mean, whoever doesn't meddle with Middle East raises first hand, because yes, Iran is meddling in Middle East affairs, and I'm not by any means justifying their actions, but the Americans are also meddling in Middle East affairs. They have soldiers, though there was no authorization for war on Congress. Our best ally are the Saudi are bombing Yemen, just like the Iranians. So whoever is without a scene in that area should I mean, there's no one who is not unculpable in that area. So I mean,
I'm sorry, but Federiga, I do want to stop here for a minute. You're comparing the United States presence in countries like Syria, where they're fighting ISIS, to the Iranian activities in Syria. I mean, this is a very harsh comparison, don't you think?
I was talking about Yemen to begin with, not about Syria. I was talking about Iraq first, where there was ill information by the American intelligence, on the basis of which we moved war to the country and destabilized the whole region. The Syria war would not be there today without what happened before in Iraq and Libya. We have to think about that. And then I was talking about Yemen, where
but we are talking about Iran today, and I mean, Iran has its own doings in Yemen too. So if we don't talk about it, we're definitely going to be expanding the conversation more about Iran, and we're trying to kind of go back to the EU-American relationship here. And David, what has something to say?
Well, she's thrown out a panoply of criticisms of America, some of which I do not agree with, some of which I do agree with. But I think it's dangerous to compare different countries and what's happening in different countries to each other, because each country is different and the situation is different. And it's also dangerous to compare what happened with the U.S. decision to go into Iraq in 2003 with right now, because that was 16 years ago. We're talking about 2 administrations ago, completely different people. I do think that the U.S. right now could do a better job of demonstrating that Iran is responsible for these attacks on the oil tankers. But I believe Iran probably is responsible. And just because Iran says it didn't do it doesn't mean it didn't do it. Excuse me.
Yeah, let's go back to the main topic. And I think here, we do want to talk about what's happening in terms of the American-European relationship. Let's start by Britain, because now we're talking about a new prime minister that's going to be joining, probably Johnson, who is very adamant about Brexit, regardless of some probably internal voices within Britain that they do want to stay within the EU. What do you think, Federiga, in terms of what's happening in Britain today, and what are we looking at in terms of options moving forward on the Brexit issue?
In short, in one word, the definition is it's a mess. And yes, Boris Johnson is saying that he's going to exit from the European Union without a deal if he becomes the prime minister. I still have to see him doing it, because one thing is campaigning for an election on extreme ideas. One thing is doing it when you are a prime minister. The reality is that British government put itself in this situation and they have no clue of how to get out of it. And it is still possible that there will be no Brexit at all.
Do you think this is a possibility that there will be no Brexit, regardless of what we're seeing? I mean, we heard May, she continuously repeated that there will be Brexit. It's very important. Now we might have Boris Johnson.
I think a lot of people are hopeful that there will not be a Brexit. Obviously, the best mechanism to move towards that potential option is to have another referendum, which is a very controversial idea in the UK. But from a legal perspective, there's nothing wrong with having another referendum if the Parliament would approve that. But the problem is, if Boris Johnson becomes the Prime Minister, that seems less likely as an option since he is so pro-Brexit. So the UK is mired in a difficult situation, as she mentioned, and if Johnson becomes the Prime Minister, it seems even more likely that we are going to have a full Brexit. But there's always the possibility that the UK can walk back from the edge of the cliff, and the best way to do that is for the people to be able to vote again in a new referendum. And they would be much better educated now on the impact of pulling out of the EU, now that they've gone through this whole process where people are much more informed about how that will affect their lives.
Do you want to comment on that, Federica?
No, I agree that that's the possibility of staying in is via referendum. The cost for Brexit, assuming this happens, is that the UK, as we know it, will be disintegrated, because I can't see a hard border in Ireland, which means probably our Northern Ireland will somehow reunite with Ireland as such, and probably the Scottish will have their own referendum and try to stay in the EU.
Mm-hmm. So that would affect Britain in so many different ways. What do you think the results were, and I want to start with you, David, to President Trump's visit to Britain, when he did talk about maybe opening some new economical channels with Britain as a response to the crisis that everybody's expecting that Britain's going to go through if they do go ahead and move forward with Brexit?
Well, I think the response was mixed. I think he may have he expressed his support for Brexit and he expressed his support for Boris Johnson. And he may have, in fact, hurt both of those things by expressing his support because he's not very popular in the UK. But at the same time, I think President Trump was right to say to the UK, no matter what happens, if you remain in the EU or you pull out of the EU, you will remain a very close ally of the US, and to hold out the possibility that there could be a strong bilateral trade deal between the US and the UK, especially if it does pull out of the EU. I think that would be appropriate, and that would be helpful to both countries in terms of strengthening the relationship and strengthening trade between both countries.
Federiga, what do you think of these American offers to Britain in exchange for Brexit?
So Trump has an interest in Brexit happening because he despises anything which is smells of multilateral, and of course the European Union is the essence of multilateralism. So he is trying to lure the British with that, but most of the trades that the UK has are with the European Union, not with the US. So we will only very partially compensate for what they have now.
Now, I mean, there's so many issues within the EU in terms of what's happening in the world. But there are now, for example, you are originally Italian, Federiga, and now there is some talks about a French-Italian issue over Libya. Can you comment on that? And I'm going to get back to you, David, on this as well.
There has been a French-Italian issue of over
Libya.
Since a long time, actually.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah, for Libya. Sorry, the French and the Italians haven't seen eye to eye on Libya for a long time. In particular, the French, at the time of Sarkozy, did not enjoy the friendship treaty that Italy signed with Libya, which essentially made Italy admit its faults during the colonial era. Italy committed to repay the country for the damage done during colonialism in terms of aid, which of course would have been used by Italian companies to rebuild the country, and that also gave Italy access to Libyan oil and made the Libyan government stop immigration at the border of Libya. And the French were not happy about that for two reasons. First, anything that says that colonial time was wrong is not very well regarded by former colonial countries. Because other former colonies could ask for the same kind of repayments. And secondly, the French oil companies were, of course, interested in penetrating the Libyan market, and they weren't happy that Eni had this kind of monopoly on Libya, which is essentially what brought Sarkozy to lead this ill-advised war in Libya, which completely destabilized the country.
Would you want to comment on that?
Sure. So I've done a lot of work in Libya. I've spent a lot of time in Libya. I previously represented the government of Libya, though I don't represent them now. So
the Sarraj.
And previous, yes, and the previous governments before that, and
yes.
I represented the rebels when they fought against Gaddafi, and I worked with them during the revolution. I disagree with her comments about the revolution in Libya. I think Gaddafi was a vicious dictator responsible for killing tens of thousands of people, and he would have killed tens of thousands of more people if the U.S. and the NATO powers had not gotten involved and helped save Libya. Unfortunately, Libya is not in a great situation now, but it would be much worse if that revolution continued without some support from the US, UK, and France. It would look more like Syria now, which is a completely devastated country. It's very unfortunate, the fighting between France and Italy over Libya. It's not helped Libya. It's been a very bad thing for Libya, and it's caused the EU to be divided on Libya. And the result is that the most trusted foreign power now in Libya is really the U.S. And they're hoping for more engagement from the U.S. The only solution in Libya
from both sides, right?
Yes,
from the Sarraj
from
and
both
Haftar.
sides.
Yes.
And the only solution in Libya is really a political solution. Libya will never solve its problems by fighting, so we should all hope for political discussions to resume.
It's interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Federica.
I agree on the political solution, but I completely disagree on the fact that the war was a good thing. The country is definitely not better off than it was under Gaddafi. That being said, yes, Gaddafi was an evil dictator, but the country is definitely not better off now, and the region is definitely not better off now.
I mean, I do
Well,
want to
she's
ask
wrong
you, Federica,
because
yeah.
if you speak to most Libyans, that's not what they would tell you. And I don't know if she's ever been to Libya, but I've been many times since the revolution. And Libyans who were in Benghazi when Gaddafi was about to attack Benghazi, who were saved because the France, UK, and the US did airstrikes, would tell you they're very thankful for that intervention.
I mean, isn't it interesting, Federica, that you are comparing it? I do want to ask you though the question, Federica, if you allow me. You're comparing the situation in Libya, and you're saying that Syria is somehow to be a better situation in your opinion, that the United States did not interfere versus what happened in Libya, and even with the instability today and the fighting. Do you think Syria is a much worse place than Libya without the American presence and intervention, which we saw in Libya?
I don't think the two wars are comparable, because the war in Libya was led by an external power, which is France, which struck, and then which brought in the rest of the country. While in Syria, this is mostly an internal, started off as an internal struggle. Also in Libya, Gaddafi was quickly topped, while Assad is still there. It's very different. It's very different countries. Also, the kind of structure of the two countries, the civil society in the two countries, were very different. So they're hard to be compared. In fact, what happened is that Libya destabilized the region and created the conditions also for Syria to happen.
Libya created the conditions to Syria. I would definitely, I'm not sure how to respond to this. What do you want to say about that, David?
I mean, I just respectfully think she's wrong. First of all, the revolution in Libya started organically. France did not start the revolution in Libya. And thousands of people have been killed when France got involved. So it is pretty similar to Syria. In both places, it started with protests against the regime. In both places, the protesters were protesting against authoritarian dictators who were responsible for egregious human rights violations and for killing their people for engaging in peaceful protests. So they're more similar than she suggests.
I do want to ask you, if you allow me, Federica, like the European Union position, like Mogherini, do you think this is basically a representation of how the EU stands today? It's viewed as very similar to the Obama administration, or even more to the left, where it's just very anti, basically intervention and helping countries who are devastated or have dictatorships that are basically killing innocent civilians. And you basically clearly say that, no, we should not be interfering to help people in these countries. They should just face it on their own.
We should not move war to third countries. That's what I'm saying. We have not been helping any of those countries. We've only brought further chaos. It's time to face the truth. None of the wars of the last 20 years have brought any results whatsoever.
Okay, well, I like you said, we do not want to compare wars, and you started by saying that the Iraq war was compared to what happened in Syria or Libya, which I completely agree with your statement. They are not to be compared at all, because Libya and Syria are situations where there was people protesting against really cruel dictatorships, very bloody, as we all know. So I do want to move, if you allow me, to what's happening between also Turkey and the EU. We see a lot of tension. There are negative comments. Now we know that also Turkey is accepting the S-400 deal from Russia. Where does that put this historical and also very important relationship between Turkey and the EU? Start, David, please.
Well, I think, Turkey has major relationship problems with the EU and with the US. The acceptance of the military hardware and equipment, S-400 rockets from Russia, is emblematic of those problems. It's hard to imagine that Turkey is committed to being a full NATO member if it's cooperating with Russia in that way. That of course interferes with the NATO relationship, and the NATO relationship is the bedrock of the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Turkey and the relationship of Turkey with the EU. So the EU has unfortunately moved, Turkey has unfortunately moved in the wrong direction, away from its, 10, 15 years ago was considering joining the EU. It was in the process of trying to accede to the EU, and it's gone exactly in the wrong direction. And simultaneously, it's become less democratic. It's become less observant of human rights. It's one of the toughest places for journalists to be engaged. There's not good reporting anymore out of Turkey because it's cracked down on free press. So Turkey is in a very problematic place right now.
Would you comment on what's happening in this very also historical and important relationship between Turkey and the EU, Federiga?
No, I agree with what David said. I mean, the Turkish leadership was so eager and so willing to join the European Union. And then when Erdogan arrived, they clearly was not interested anymore. And as David said, Turkey has involuted into an autocracy, almost dictatorship. If you look at certain indicators, if you look at the elections in Istanbul that were cancelled because the winner was not what Erdogan wanted. So the question to David is, it's a dictator, he's not respecting human rights, he's not respecting freedom of press, so shall we intervene? It's more complicated than that.
Well, but we just said again that we're not going to be comparing these different examples. I mean, wouldn't we just, you said that and we agreed with you.
Yes, so but it's a general principle.
Each country is its own.
Principle. Are we intervening? Are we supposed to intervene anytime there's a country does not respect human rights and democracy?
Okay, so I do want to talk about the Russian aspect. When Turkey now is basically buying the S-400, what does that mean in terms of going forward? Obviously, in the American-Turkish relationship, not to mention the EU, I mean, there's Russia now.
Well, Turkey's armed forces have been set up to be interoperable with the NATO forces and with the U.S. forces. And so this is a big setback for that. And it's unclear what is now going to happen next. Is Turkey going to buy more from Russia? Is there going to be a stronger partnership between the Turkish military and the Russian military? That's a scary scenario for NATO. It's really disruptive to NATO, and it shows the effort by Russia to expand its influence in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, and it's also trying to expand its influence in Africa.
What's your comment on this, on the Russian now basically probably also taking over the relationship with Turkey in terms of its usual and Western atmosphere previously?
I don't think they're taking over. I rather think that Erdogan, by buying Russian weapons, wants two things probably. One, to send a signal to the Western world that we are disposable, even though is disposable. And the second thing, he probably wants more of a free hands, in the sense that he doesn't want weapons that somehow, because he wants more freedom in the way he uses, I think, which is very scary thought if you think about it.
Now let's talk about the Russian-EU relationships. There is the British aspect when there is a chemical weapons attack, basically, in London. The accused is Russia for targeting a former agent, a Russian agent. But now, we do know that there's a lot of different opinions probably within the EU. Some countries are more pro the opening up to Russia. Some countries are much less excited about such a thing. What would you comment on this new dynamic in terms of Russia?
The EU is also, a little bit divided on Russia, and should be one of the areas where they should be completely unified. The new Prime Minister of Ukraine visited Germany and France, and those meetings seemed to go well. And the new Prime Minister of Ukraine was very strong in his rhetoric toward Russia, and he wants for the Russian-supported separatist forces in eastern Ukraine to leave. He wants a political solution, and Germany and France and Merkel and Macron support that. So I'd like to see some more cooperation and more pushback against Russia on the issue of its presence in eastern Ukraine, but it's really going to depend on the ability of the EU to be unified in this. And it's an area where the EU can rally together because they have a common interest in stopping Russian aggression and Russian expansionism.
What's your comment on that, Federiga?
I think that the EU has responded with sanctions. Sanction has been prolonged until December, so there was a united front. That being said, there are nuances in the way the countries see Russia within the European Union. There are also differences in how much on the kind of relation these countries, each of the European countries, have with Russia, and also the idea that the Europeans would completely cut with Russians, which is something that has been put forward in every single meeting I've ever been as a government representative in the past over than a decade, is wishful thinking. The Europeans will never cut with Russia because they have a common history, they have common interests.
So it's Putin, in your opinion. What about Ukraine and countries like Ukraine who are also asking for help from the EU?
Ukraine is deeply divided in itself as well. So I agree that a political solution should be it's the only possible solution, which will mean that both sides will have to give something.
Do you agree it's divided Ukraine? I mean, I know that there's a Russian.
I mean, it's obviously
Eastern.
there's some divisions, but it's a very small minority of people in Ukraine who support what Russia is doing and what Putin is doing. The very few Ukrainians support Russia's annexation of Crimea or its efforts to create take part of eastern Ukraine. And I think the elections show that. I think this prime minister got won by a large margin. This prime minister has been very clear about his view on Russian expansionism, as was the previous one. And so I don't agree with her that Ukrainians are divided on the issue of Russia. Most Ukrainians are afraid of Russian expansionism.
I didn't say that Ukrainians are divided on Putin. Sorry, I said that Ukraine is a deeply divided and different country with two languages, with very deep division running into the society, and that has consequences when we are negotiating a political solution.
What about, I want to ask you, Federiga, about Italy, because Italy also, the current prime minister views Putin as an ally.
Oh, he also sees Trump as an ally, so I wouldn't be worried about that.
But I mean, does that tell us also about the changing narrative in some countries in the EU, such as Italy?
No. The relationship between Russia and Italy dates back of several centuries. If you ever have been in St. Petersburg, you will notice that it has been built by Italian architects. So it's a very long-standing relationship, which continued during the Cold War because Italy had the strongest communist party in Europe together with France. So the Christian Democrats, if they wanted to have NATO and the European policy community at the time approved, they also needed to keep relationship with Russia with the Friendship Treaty. And so there have been continuous relationship between the two countries for centuries and they continued after World War II, which are very strong also economic and cultural ties. So there is nothing new with this government, which didn't existed already under the previous many governments.
I do want to move to the EU position on the China sanctions, because this is a very big topic today. The United States is very now so-called by some people, aggressive towards China economically on sanctioning some of these companies that, according to the United States and other sources, that China is continuously violating economical treaties and etc. How do you view this, and how is that going to also kind of undermine the relationship between the United States and the EU, especially the countries who disagree on this policy?
Well, China has not been a fair trade partner with the U.S. It does violate trade rules. In particular, it violates intellectual property. It constantly steals intellectual property of U.S. companies. That's a problem. And so I think President Trump was right to stand up for U.S. companies and to be much more hardline on trade issues with respect to China. And his tariffs on China do seem to be having some positive impact. Some companies that were manufacturing in China are leaving because of that. And some of those companies are coming back to the US. Some of them are moving to Europe. And that's a good thing for the US and for Europe. And it should force China to change and to come more in compliance, or at least provide incentives for China to play on a level playing field and to come into compliance. So let's hope that continues. But let's hope they don't have a full-blown trade war that hurts the global economy.
What do you comment on that, Federica?
No, I essentially agree with it. I would only add that part of the problems we're having today, especially it's because the TTIP and the TPP were abandoned by President Trump. So especially TPP left China the only main actor, the major actor in the region with cash. So though I agree with what you said, I think that the U.S. is putting itself in an isolated position, which won't help its cause at the end of the day. Because yes, the sanctions, they may push the Chinese to change. It remains to be seen, but they're also hurting a lot American business.
I do, because, economy in private, the free trade in the world that we have today also has a mind of its own. Because even when we talk about, for example, the EU's position on the Iran nuclear deal, the companies refuse to go to Iran. So it's, you can say that the United States is isolated, but these companies are choosing and making decisions based on their own interests. And this is a continuous thing that we're going to continue to see in the world today.
Let me ask you something. The companies are refusing to go to Iran, and who is going into Iran now?
No, the companies are refusing to go to Iran. They're not listening to the governments because they have their own interests to care about, and they don't want to. They're not interested in these countries.
Yeah, but the question is, who's trading, for instance, oil with Iran right now? China. Mm-hmm. So it's more complex than. So the world is more interconnected that we like to think, and the thing is that the Chinese have been acting a little bit as a bully, and now they found another one who is acting as a bully. But bully to bully doesn't always work that well,
Okay, so basically, I think Federica was saying that this administration is a bully because of the way it's carrying on its sanctions against China. Do you have a comment?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the U.S. has some justification to force China to come into compliance with its trade responsibilities with respect to the U.S., in particular, to put in place better protections for intellectual property, and that there are some aspects of the current tariffs that Trump has put on China that have actually been positive for the U.S. and positive for Europe and also positive for some of our other partners. I was reading today about a bicycle maker, Giant, which is one of the biggest bicycle manufacturers in the world. It did most of its manufacturing in China. As soon as this trade war started, it closed one of its factories in China. It moved orders to Taiwan, and it's opening a new factory in Hungary. Those are all positives for Europe and for U.S. allies, and it's forcing China to recognize that it cannot be the manufacturing behemoth that it has been if it's not going to engage in fair trade.
Well, I do want to, unless you have a comment, Federica, I do want to go back to the elephant in the room, which is Iran, on how is what is the way, in your opinion, Federiga, on how to respond to the issue of the nuclear deal, of the nuclear weapon, of the threats to enriching uranium very, very soon?
We had responded in the best possible way, which was the Iran deal.
Yeah, but that's
So the
it's
best
2025. I mean, even that nuclear deal had a ceiling. I mean, what about after that?
Well, we don't even have the U.S. inside it now. So the best possible way is for the U.S. to change its policy, get back into the deal, and start thinking and negotiating about the future. The problem is that nobody trusts the U.S. anymore. I mean, it's the way policies are conducted. It leads to a distrust of American administration. And if you distrust in foreign policy, you can't negotiate. So how to negotiate? I don't try.
Would you want to comment about the nuclear deal? In your opinion, David, what is the solution for this issue? Because the nuclear deal within itself, the nuclear issue with the Iranian regime is not something there was no final solution for it, even with the nuclear deal, because it does have a ceiling, it does end. So in your opinion today, what is the best solution for this administration and how to move forward with this issue?
The best solution is for the U.S. to make clear that it wants to renegotiate a nuclear deal that has some differences with the previous nuclear deal that President Obama signed, that address some of the concerns that President Trump and the administration have about that deal and the weaknesses in that deal. And the U.S. and Europe should get together and have a unified approach on a deal proposal to Iran. In return, for entering into that deal, Iran would get the sanctions relief that it is really hoping for, that it needs because its economy is really hurting. That's the only solution, and hopefully we can move forward towards that. But right now, there's no progress on that. President Trump and the Europeans don't even seem to be talking about that right now.
What would you comment on that, Federiga? Because he's saying that, David is saying that it's important to address the other issues of the Iranian aggression as well, and not only the nuclear issue alone.
The deal, it was possible to negotiate and successfully close the deal because it was only focused on that issue. I mean, the moment you enlarge the scope, we won't be able to negotiate it anymore. And the problem is, under this deal, Iran was supposed to see some of those sanctions lifted. So what is the incentive today for the Iranians to actually negotiate a new deal with someone they deeply distrust? If you want, I agree that we have to negotiate, we have to start to negotiate a new deal, but the only possible way to do that is to first for the U.S. to go back in the current deal. So giving the Iranians a signal that they can be trusted. I mean, there is no way an international deal can be negotiated without mutual trust. And there is no mutual trust today.
You know, I have to be really honest with you on television. I'm going to tell you right now, Federiga, you know, I was born and raised in Syria, and I've witnessed and experienced firsthand what happened by the Assad regime and by the Iranians in my country, that where I was born and raised. And for you to be saying that, you know, Iran cannot trust the United States, well, can we trust the Iranians? I mean, isn't that the bigger question here? Iran did not only that there are other, you know, question marks about the compliance of the nuclear deal, but the actions, the terrorist activities, and the sectarian cleansing that they did in a country like Syria, it seems that you did not and continue not to want to address in any way or acknowledge.
You know, I was born and raised in Italy. The first covert action of the CIA to influence an election in another country was Italy in 1946, all right? Sorry, 1948. So we probably have very different perspectives. I'm not saying the Iranians can be trusted on everything. I'm saying that on the issue of the nuclear issue, they have been the one which complied with the deal.
But
and
you're talking about a war in 1946. I'm talking about 2019, Federica. I mean, those are the people are continuing to get slaughtered in Syria. I'm also Kurdish, by the way, so this I also can have both arguments with you. I mean, you know, I'm just talking about 2019 right now.
Yeah, 2019, the Iranians have been complying with the deal. The Americans have not.
I mean, that deal, do you think that deal was fair trade to give hundreds of millions of dollars to the Iranian regime while they continue to sponsor terrorism in the region and kill innocent people?
They have not continued to enrich uranium. They have been complying with that deal. If we want other deals to take place, we need to respect the deals which exist. And in this moment, the country that is not respecting the deal, the nuclear deal, is the US. So any other deal cannot be negotiated because there is no belief that once a deal is negotiated, the US will stick to it. That's the problem. There is a problem of trustability on the US right now in 2019.
Go ahead, David.
I mean, let's be clear. The least trustworthy actor in all of this is Iran. And it has been and always will be. Now, I do agree with her that Iran was mostly complying with the nuclear deal, and that was a positive for the world. But the U.S., under this administration, decided to pull out of that deal. They didn't cheat on the deal. They made clear publicly they were pulling out of the deal, and that legally was the right of President Trump. I don't agree with that decision, but he made it very clear he was going to do it, and then he followed through and did it. So it's not very useful to talk about the past now. What we should be talking about is the future, and how do we get all of these countries to the table so we can have a new nuclear deal that addresses some of the concerns of President Trump and addresses the concerns of his administration and why they pulled out, but also brings back the Europeans and other key actors to the party and forces Iran to agree to not develop nuclear weapons, which is what's most important for the world.
I mean,
I'm sorry.
Go
From
ahead.
this legal perspective, if you follow this reasoning, Iran, after all, has a legal right to withdraw from NPT. I mean, these nuclear deals have been incredibly hard. NPT, nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So these deals have been really hard to negotiate. And again, nobody wants to enter a deal with an actor which is unrational and untrustable. That's the problem. So if the US wants to have a better deal, in their own words, they first have to comply with the deal which was negotiated by the US. In international relations, if the first thing a new government does is denouncing what existed before, its strength is diminished.
Yep, and that was a very controversial deal, and it was not even signed by any of the parties, according to facts and reports about the nuclear deal. It was never signed by the U.S. or anybody else. I mean, this is a very interesting and complex conversation that I think we will continue to have. I want to thank you so much, Federica, for joining us from California, and thank you so much, David. We are out of time for today. Would love to have you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching. Good night.